As I'm sure you're aware, communication is really that which undergirds all of negotiation. And what seems so simple, right? An idea is expressed and another idea is expressed in response is fraught with all sorts of possibilities for misinterpretation and distortion. I'm not going to spend a ton of time explaining this graphic, but I think it's pretty clear that while we, for example, in the role of sender of a message, we get this idea in our head and we create the message and we send it, whether in person, via email, or in any other setting. The hope is that the receiver receives the message in a way that we've intended and that there's no misunderstanding. But as you know, there are all sorts of places where within this capture of this process that things can go wrong. And again, I don't want to spend a lot of time going through all of those, but you can see as you look at all the different places where something can go wrong, and more importantly, in just the way our minds work, our biases, the way we look at the world, the value sets that we have, the goals we have in life, the way we were raised, our culture, our religion, our morals, all of these things affect the way that we communicate. And so since negotiation is all about communication, how we ask for what we want, how others provide a counter offer, for example, or perhaps say nothing at all, what does it mean? And that's what we're going to spend a little time in kind of peeling back this onion. So I mentioned in our session together that we might think that it's just a matter of choosing the right words in order to be understood, but that is inadequate. In fact, words in the messages we transmit only account for about 7% of the meaning. So what people pick up from what we say or what we ask for in a negotiation, let's just say the vast majority of what they pick up may not be in the words alone. How we stand, how closely we stand, whether we have our hand over our mouth or are looking away at the time we make the most difficult part of our ask. These are all part of what accounts for the meaning in communication. And as I mentioned in our session, there's some research that suggests that the body language, the nonverbal messages that our bodies communicate, whether accurately understood or not, that our body language is actually more accurate, that the way our bodies are designed and the limbic system and how we respond to situations, our body tells a more accurate, a more truthful story. And I'll leave you to think about that for a moment. And another component of the nonverbal message is the tone of our voice, whether we're shouting, of course, but also the inflection and the intonation. And, you know, again, these things are often conflated with our language and how we communicate, but actually the words themselves account for so very little of the meaning that's transmitted, which is why it's important to kind of take a deeper look at and understand what the challenges are in communicating effectively, as well as in understanding and listening to what others in the negotiation are attempting to communicate. So here's an example, a very simple example. A speaker communicates a task that he or she believes is pretty straightforward, says to another employee, "I need this done as soon as possible." But because the listener may have sensed a relaxed body posture, may not have sensed any urgency in the voice, or perhaps the communication was written, which is a very not so rich form of communication, may have interpreted as soon as possible as, well, you know, the next week or so. So I'm sure you can all relate to examples like this where you were on either side of such a request. And so again, it bears some conversation about how we can take an honest look at our own communication as a first step in trying to recognize what we could do to be more effective at the negotiating table, and through doing so, understand better how to help others be more clear in their communication. So, kind of to start things off, I just want to present you with a few different examples of issues that could arise that could potentially lead to a conflict of sorts, for which negotiating may be a mechanism for resolving the conflict. So imagine, first of all, you're part of a work team that meets every Wednesday at 2 p.m. And let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this is once we are back in the office, and Anthony, who's a member of the team, arrives what appears to be kind of casually at about 20 after the start of the meeting and says, "What did I miss?" So pause your slides for the moment and jot down, if you will, what, if anything, would you do in response to this situation, assuming that this is the first time it happened? Okay, I'm going to go forward, but again, I'd like you to jot down, how would you, not how would you like to respond, but how would you likely respond, if at all? What would you do or say in a situation where you're part of this work team that Anthony casually arrives late and asks what he missed? All right, here's the next. Someone who reports to you has turned in work that contains multiple errors despite previous requests you've made that they proofread their work. And again, I'm going to ask you, pause the recording and jot down, what would you do in a situation like this? What would you say? What would you do? Perhaps even through what medium would you transmit this message? And then last but not least, you're presenting the results of a project that you worked on to your supervisor's boss. In other words, your boss's boss, skipping a level. During the presentation, your supervisor jumps in and appears to be taking over, finishing the presentation for you. So again, I'd like you to write down, what would you say or do, if anything, at the moment or shortly after the supervisor cuts in, or if the answer for that question for you is nothing at all, then perhaps what would you do once the presentation ended? So I'll let you decide what assumptions you make for that and jot down what you think. And again, pause just to give yourself a moment to write this down. So I ask these questions not to judge you, not to tell you what % of students in the past when I've asked this question answer X, Y, or Z, but rather really think for a moment why it is that you respond the way you do, and what is the message that would send. Now recall, words only make up 7% of our messages. So even if you choose, let's say, to say nothing or send what you think is a telepathic message, what message would that send? And I'm going to talk briefly about these three, but recognize this is a wonderful conversation that maybe you can have in your learning groups, because practicing how to respond in situations like this, recognizing what your norm is, what is comfortable for you, and what that is comfortable for you, what implications that may have for you in general and in particular in a negotiation. So let's take the Anthony situation for a moment. And let's be fair, I don't know too many people who could say that in their entire professional careers that they have never come late to a meeting. It's part of being human, right? And maybe Anthony's kind of casual appearance or casual approach to being late Or maybe he even offered oh, there was a lot of traffic. What we say says a lot, not just about the moment, but about what is and isn't okay in this meeting. So while some of you might be thinking, let's give Anthony let's cut him some slack and no big deal, I've been late before as well. If he shows up 20 minutes late and none of the members of this work team say anything, you know what the message is, right? The message is, come anytime, whenever you feel like it. We're not so concerned. And that message goes to Anthony. It also goes to the rest of the group. So if there are no consequences to showing up whenever you feel like it, okay, I'm overstating that slightly, why would anybody look at the start time as something that is set in stone? On the other hand, whether you talk with Anthony the moment he shows up and read him the riot act, that's not what I'm going for either. So what would be the best way to approach Anthony if you were to approach Anthony? Do you want to gang up and have the whole team talk to him? Do you want to have one person talk with him one-on-one? Talk with him after the meeting? Again, there are some options, but what I would say to you is, when you say nothing, and I mean say as opposed to wincing or sneering or rolling your eyes, which you may think, or perhaps tapping your watch, those nonverbal messages that you might want to send in lieu of a direct confrontation will likely send the message, we don't care. No worries, come whenever you feel like it, you and anybody else in this team. So again, I'm not telling you what the correct answer is. There are a lot of ways to approach this, but I will say one thing for sure: saying nothing says it's okay. In the second one, I know for some, this one is a little bit uncomfortable, right? This is one of the more difficult conversations, which is giving constructive feedback to an employee. And in this case, giving constructive feedback multiple times, so that the requests have been made, that the work is proofread, but in fact, it doesn't appear that it has been. We can peel back the layers of this question as well, which is, how clear were those previous requests? Were they, oh, hey, it'd be nice if next time you turn something in, you proofread it, haha. And I say that. Now, some of you might think, oh my God, what is she saying? I've talked with a bunch of millennials who seem to be as fluent in sarcasm as they are in English. And here's the thing. It's my considered opinion, after teaching topics like this for over 2 decades, that sarcasm is often used when somebody lacks the comfort and competence to directly confront a situation. They think that perhaps throwing in a little ha-ha or sarcasm would be a way to kind of soften the blow of this direct request or direct feedback, when in fact it may have the exact opposite effect. And I'll hold on to that for just a moment until we get a little later in the slides. So last but not least, in this case, and you may have noticed that these 3 examples go from probably medium to a little more difficult to much more difficult in terms of how comfortable you would be in responding in a situation like this. There's a power difference here. You're standing in front of your boss and your boss's boss, and you're blindsided if you're the presenter. And so again, while there is no correct response to this scenario, the one thing I would caution you, as I have in the first example, is to say nothing to how your boss kind of jumped in and took over the presentation that you worked very hard on, is to say that you can do this anytime, feel free. And I imagine most of you, if not all of you, are not too keen to send that message. So we'll dig a little bit deeper in these, but again, I wanted to kind of motivate this conversation by sharing some pretty typical kind of everyday situations that you might face in the workplace, albeit not in negotiating per se, but I wanted to start there to kind of capture your attention. So I want to get into this topic of you don't get what you don't ask for. And one way to do that is to ask Dilbert to help. This actually appeared quite a long time ago, 25 years ago. And in just 2 frames, it says it all, right? If you don't ask for what you want, you probably won't get it. Doesn't mean that if you do ask for what you want, that you will get it. But if you ask for little, well, then you probably will get that. So how assertive are you? Based on some of the feedback that you shared with me when I asked about your expectations in the course, I wonder how assertive some of you are. And again, this is not about judgment. This is about our comfort level, our habits, the way we are raised, any cultural influences, gender influences, etc. And I invite you, it's not required, but I invite you to consider taking the assertion inventory. It's a multi-question survey developed about 35 years ago that I placed in the module. And you'll notice in this inventory that for every question, there are 2 sub-questions. One is, how uncomfortable does this situation or request make you feel? And the second part is, what is the likelihood that you would actually do the thing that is being asked? And so were you to complete this assertion inventory, again, you might pause the slides now and go to that part in the module to pick up the survey. It'd probably take you about 10 minutes or so to complete the survey. I'll show you the scoring in a bit. So what is assertive communication? Well, when we speak assertively, it's a matter of standing up for who we are and what we feel is fair and right, taking into account at the same time what is fair and right and the feelings of others. So it's not jumping on somebody or jumping down their throat, but rather it's being clear about what you want, what you deserve, what you think is fair, what is right in a situation like this, while not taking all the air out of the room. It shows respect for others while at the same time ensuring that you are being heard. So if you go back to our conversation about the conflict styles, assertive communication and people who are assertive probably don't score the highest in avoidance and probably don't score the highest in accommodation. Because for those who are uncomfortable about being clear about what they want and why they want it and voicing that, it becomes a matter of deference, right? No, you. Well, I'll give you what you want. I'll give you what you need. So one of the things that is really, really important to recognize is that being assertive is not synonymous with being aggressive. I'll talk about aggressive in just a moment, but assertive is about being direct, but also tactful, honest, but also sensitive and fair. And of course, these are approximations. What exactly does it mean to be fair? But notice the goal here is to speak up for yourself while at the same time recognizing others. Passive communication is, for example, you're reflecting back on the Anthony coming late situation and you roll your eyes, maybe that's a little passive aggressive, or you write a note in your pad, late again, jeez. But bottom line is people who are passive for whatever reason tend to avoid conflict. They would speak up very little, if at all, and in so doing, they would probably speak in ways that are very indirect, for fear of stirring up the waters, right? And so the same people who are indirect and not speaking up about their concerns are likely to be bullied, likely to be easily persuaded, because again, you put others' needs ahead of yours. And so again, with the Anthony example, no big deal, right? If Anthony is late. But if Anthony is late regularly and creates a lack of productivity in the team, creates frustration with having to kind of stop, go back, and review where we were, this could become frustrating, not to mention feelings of resentment of, wait a second, I'm making my business to get here on time. I left early the previous meeting so that I can get here. Again, by saying nothing, yes, it's true you avoid conflict, but the conflict doesn't go away. It just gets temporarily swept under the rug. The last bullet there, some of you might relate to. Again, in the spirit of pleasing others and being, quote, a nice guy or a nice gal, the downside of being passive means many people have no idea what your real opinion is, because you're so busy keeping it quiet, or perhaps being a chameleon. Yeah, that sounds good. I'll go with the group's whatever says, whatever the group says. On the other end of the spectrum, people who communicate aggressively, it's all about dominating and winning. And recall, before you say, well, that's not me, we are hardwired in negotiation to be distributive. We are hardwired to win, because if we don't, the other person will. So recognize that the way we are hardwired in negotiation, and the fact that we can get defensive, especially when somebody is threatening what is rightly ours or what should be ours, we may go from being assertive to being aggressive when we're feeling that kind of threat. So people who communicate aggressively are pushy. They use absolute terms. You never, I always, this isn't fair, never accepting the blame. Well, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for what you did. This kind of domination is, of course, very uncomfortable to be around. Recognize that it often comes from insecurity, unresolved anger, and perhaps the fact that nobody has checked them on their behavior in the past, that their a-hole-like behavior has, for the most part, since others have said nothing, it has been supported and continued. So again, I know that you're pretty familiar with what aggressive communication sounds like, but in a negotiation situation, this can be very difficult to be opposite, and the temptation may be to fight fire with fire, and as you know, that will just escalate the conflict. So if you did complete the assertion inventory and want to know where you fall, okay, again, with apologies that the world doesn't fall into 2x2 matrices, this gives you some idea of where you might fall. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on it. You could see where you might fall. And the box is quite large. The range, for example, 40 to 104 is a pretty wide range. So you might think about, where in this box you might fall. Are you smack dab in the middle? Are you kind of on an edge toward another box? But recognize that in the bottom corner, the bottom right corner, assertiveness from this instrument is identified as in situations that require you to step up and to speak out, you feel in general a relatively low or low to moderate degree of discomfort, and feel quite comfortable, or at least reasonably likely, in your ability to respond, the likelihood that you would respond. Some of you might find yourselves in the middle box, the unassertive/passive box, which is the exact opposite. You see the situation, it sets off bells. Oh my God, I don't want to be here. This doesn't feel good. Somebody needs to say something to this person, but it's not going to be me. So you don't respond, but you secretly wish and hope and send that telepathic message to others that they should. And you can imagine how successful that approach will be much of the time. In the right-hand middle box, anxious performer, this is probably somebody who recognizes that being direct, confronting where necessary, is probably the better path, but feels uncomfortable doing so. And more practice and also some frameworks, which I'll share with you in a moment, can help the anxious performer. Finally, in the don't care category, these are folks who are not uncomfortable, but they're also not so likely to respond. It's just whatever. They don't care. So I'll leave it at that. And again, this is not judgment. This is kind of a baseline. This is a chance for you to, with one instrument, see where you are in terms of the likelihood of being assertive in different kinds of situations. This instrument contained a multitude of situations, so you take that for what it's worth. I mentioned having a framework. This has been around for a while. You may have seen something like this in the past, but I find it pretty straightforward and helpful. So when you're in an Anthony situation or with a subordinate who continues to turn in substandard work, even with the boss who cuts you off mid-presentation and seems to take over, you might position what you want to say in this framework, where you express first your perspective of the situation. In other words, if you were to take a picture of what's happening and describe it, here's what I see. Notice it's your perspective. It's not everybody says that, because that's not ownership. Notice in the example, I've noticed that each time I bring up our deadline, you roll your eyes, right? This is an observable behavioral response that the person may not be aware of, but you have noticed. So this is not judgmental. This is just, here's something that happens each time I bring up the deadline. Second, your feelings about the situation. How does their behavior affect you? Notice the I language. I'm concerned and upset that it'll affect my ability to meet the customer deadline. Why is this so important? Well, when we take ownership of our feelings, you're much less likely to cause defensiveness on the other side. When you say, you're not listening to me, you're making me mad, you're pissing me off, that language, the you language, really does a lot to create defensiveness and escalate conflict. So I've noticed this happens. I'm concerned, I'm disappointed, I'm upset, I'm frustrated, but own it, I am. And then finally, what is it that you want? And this is where some of us stop short. Here's the perspective and my feelings. No, be clear. Here's what I'd like. I'd like you to have your part of the project complete by Friday. Can you do this? Now, you may be looking at this example and thinking, my gosh, I'll be here all day with all these words, but you need to customize it at your will. It's something that really, in just these three components, says, I've noticed something going on. I'm not comfortable about it and the way it feels to me, and here's what I would like. The good news about it is if you deliver it this way, the person receiving your feedback has a choice. You're not telling them you must do X. And if you don't do it, right, ultimatums, trust me, you don't want to be on the receiving end of an ultimatum and you don't want to give one. But when you put it this way, you give the other person their due as an adult with agency, and they could choose to respond or not. Ultimately, it's a matter of, here's some information. about how your behavior affects me. I would like to see something different, but ultimately you choose. And it is this kind of feedback that is more often accepted graciously by the receiver, more often, not always, and therefore gives the person a chance to kind of reflect on the feedback. Because remember, some people never get feedback because a lot of us are uncomfortable giving feedback. When they get that feedback and they reflect on it, they may think differently about how they behave. So I hope you think about this and take opportunities to practice, whether in personal situations or professional situations. So we've talked about kind of the communicating, the sending information out part of communication. For this last part, I want to focus a little bit on taking information in, listening. And as you know, there's hearing, which is a physiological process that when our ears and all the parts inside work, that's just the words. Listening goes beyond that. It includes attaching meaning. It includes taking in the words, the 7%, as well as the nonverbal, the 93%. So when you are truly listening, you are practicing these 3 dimensions: sensing, processing, and responding. And we'll talk about that more in just a bit. So when I say nonverbal, just to be clear, there's a number of things that nonverbal communication comprises. Eye contact is one, but I will say eye contact is one of the more culturally relative components. So for example, someone who is American and has spent most of their career working in the US or for US firms will expect direct, not continuous or penetrating, but direct and fairly strong eye contact. In the absence of that, many Americans will assume things like that person is not trustworthy, that person is not confident, that person may be lying, right? They're looking away so as not to own the lie. Again, what I will say is that there is always room for interpretation. The one thing I can say is that what we know for sure about nonverbal communication is that it depends, right? Talk about gestures for a moment. How many times have you heard, oh, if you cross your arms over your chest, that means you're defensive and you're not taking in any new information? Maybe in some cases. Here's a hint. Why not ask, right? So rather than assume that somebody's gestures mean a certain thing, you might ask the question, hey, I've noticed that you did X. I want to make sure I'm not misinterpreting. What are you feeling right now? What's on your mind? What are you thinking? Gestures, by the way, are also very culturally relative. I'm sure you're all familiar with the AOK symbol that involves the circle formed by the thumb and pointer and then the other 3 fingers kind of standing up, right? How was the wine? Okay. That same gesture in France has a completely different meaning. If the waiter serves you a lovely glass of wine and asks you, how is the wine? And you hold up that gesture, the quote AOK gesture, then what you're communicating is 0. The wine is a 0, by the way. And even worse in Arabic cultures, what this same gesture means, and I won't talk about that. I'm sure you've also noticed in different parts of the world and with different people who have had different experiences or cultural influences, how big our bubble is, how closely we stand to other people also communicates power. It may communicate kind of comfort with a more intimate setting that people don't necessarily share, right? So that communicates. Even timing. when you show up to a meeting on time versus not, when you leave early, and how you look at timing in general. Are you one that always gets things turned in on time, or do you think of deadlines as guidelines and then plus or minus a few days, right? So again, there's a lot that can be said about all of this, but what I will repeat is that there is no absolute in nonverbal. There's so many things that influence people's gestures, and as I said earlier, they tend to be more authentic as far as compared to one's own words. But even then, the question is, well, what does it really mean if somebody is communicating non-verbally but comes from a culture that is different from mine? So, and there are gender differences as well. So back to what are the different sort of levels of listening, if you will. And I'm sure you've heard the term active or empathic listening before. And sure, in an intense negotiation, that really should be the goal, the level of listening to which you should aspire. But at the same time, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to do well. It really is this constant process of hearing and taking the other's perspective, trying to understand where they're coming from. And when you're not so sure, you ask questions and through your feedback, hey, I'm not sure if what you intended was X, but I'm kind of getting the sense that you're talking about Y. Can you explain? Right? So by getting into this two-way process and truly listening, not practicing your rebuttal, not waiting for them to take a breath so that you can jump in, this kind of active listening requires empathy. And to that end, I would encourage you to pause the slides and take a 3-minute listen to one of my favorite videos that Brene Brown, favorite videos full stop, and it features Brene Brown in talking about empathy. So again, from the slide, I don't really need to talk about the other types of listening, but we do it. We do listen sort of halfway, especially, I want to say, in this work from home environment when so many of us are multitasking because we're sitting at our desk and we have other papers open, our phone, etc. And whether you have your video on or off, you figure you can get away with other things. Well, that type of listening is okay in some situations, but probably going to get in the way of a really successful negotiation. So speaking of negotiation, a few points to kind of summarize or highlight, and that is when you practice active listening, recognizing again how much energy it takes to do well, it does show others that you really do care about them and are concerned. Typically, right? Hey, Bob, you and I disagree about X. Let me explain one more time why my idea is superior. I know you would never say anything like this, but imagine taking the other approach. Hey, Bob, you and I see this situation a bit differently. Tell me again why you think your approach is going to be the better path to resolving this problem. What happens next? Bob explains, you listen, you demonstrate that you're listening, and in the spirit of reciprocity, the next thing to happen is Bob asks you, okay, tell me more about what you think we should do, right? When we're listened to, when we're attended to, we are more likely to reciprocate that gift of paying attention. So think about that, how important that is. I know some of us are kind of old school, he who talks the longest and the loudest wins, but that's distributive, that's old school, that's about one-off transactions where winning, quote unquote, may in fact be appropriate. But in this long-term relationship, vendor-supplier partnership, multiple year, if not lifetime relationships world, active listening plays an even more important role. It also helps the other party, especially if they're feeling a bit emotional, helps them feel like they've been heard. And I alluded to that a moment ago, but again, it can calm another person down because you're not just saying, yeah, I hear you, but, right? So it sounds like while you would like to get the price of X, what's really important is to getting delivery by Wednesday morning. Got it, right? So I talked about the reciprocity, and obviously when you practice this kind of active listening, it really does build better relationships. It really does help both parties or all parties look at negotiation as not a test of wills, but rather an opportunity to collaborate and problem solve together to find a solution that we all can benefit from. So one thing I'm going to mention briefly, and this is not a negotiation per se, or at least not the kind of negotiations that we will spend most of our time talking about in class, but I think it does a really good job of illustrating the challenges and the miscommunication that occurs in our daily lives. So imagine, if you will, it's Sunday morning, and it's the morning of the afternoon of the, sorry for the traditional cisgender example, but morning of the afternoon of the husband's company's annual picnic. Okay, so it's 10 a.m. The picnic starts at 3, and this is an annual picnic of the husband's company. So imagine further in this example, husband is sitting in his favorite easy chair reading the Sunday paper, and also in the room, the wife is ironing her dress and looks over at the husband, whose nose is in the paper, and says, "Do we really have to go to this picnic?" To which the husband says, "Yeah." Clearly, that's not an example of effective communication, but I'm going to invite you to reflect on that and think about all the possible ways that this could have gone better. Or said differently, where were the mistakes in this example? And I'll give you a hint. The wife in this example has made far more mistakes than the husband. So I might ask you to, if you have the time, engage in that conversation in your learning groups, in the discussion board. And at some point, I'll share with you what I think all those possible issues are. But again, even though that in and of itself may not sound like the kind of negotiations you're in this program to perfect, what we do in our everyday lives does predict to some degree what we do in our professional lives, right? If we ignore the opportunities to have these kind of everyday negotiations, we don't flex that negotiating muscle. So we'll come back to that, but I wanted to kind of place that out there. Okay, last thing that I want to mention briefly, and this is also in the text from chapter 7 from my negotiation and dispute resolution book. There are 4 overarching strategies for communication and negotiation. First of all, agenda setting. And that's kind of pretty straightforward. I'm sure it makes sense. But in a negotiation, it's a meeting. And just like any other meeting, time will get away from you if you don't really have a plan for how to spend the time. And there's nothing wrong, in my opinion, with a soft start, say a 2 p.m. start with a little bit of, hey, how was your weekend and what's up in the world, etc., etc. But at 5 after, we start the negotiation for real. In fact, I often encourage that because that kind of small talk does increase and build the trust among participants. It does have the ability to do that. So you can even add that in the agenda. But think about this negotiation as a meeting. What are the issues to be discussed and in what order? How much time would we spend on each of these issues, at least as a guideline? And also very important, is there a place at the end of the meeting, 5 minutes before, where we could get back together and discuss, well, if we haven't addressed all the issues, when is our next meeting and where and for how long and in what context? So a lot can be said in these meetings, and it's a great idea to have this structure going in. As one member of a multi-person negotiation, you can come in with a proposed agenda. And it is there where you might say, hey, listen, in case anybody else hadn't, here's my idea about how we can spend our time. What do you think? Get the buy-in, of course, but start with a straw man. Questioning is such an incredibly useful tool. You'll notice that in every strategy outline I ask you to complete, I ask you to think about what questions will I ask, which open-ended questions will I ask, because there's no better way to understand what others want than to ask them. I know that sounds too obvious, right? But using the kinds of questions that we talked about very briefly and you took a photo of in class, the kinds of open-ended, manageable questions that really help all of us understand others' positions and interests, priorities among the potentially competing interests, and just to kind of like get a sense for where they stand on certain things or how close they might be to coming to a resolution in the negotiation. So using these kinds of well-prepared, open-ended questions, you can do a much better job of understanding where others are coming from and linking to what you heard. So it's not enough to say, I heard you, but rather, I heard you that delivery is more important than price at this moment. How about I share with you a projected delivery plan and see what you think about whether this will meet your needs, right? So it is deliberate, connecting to what you've heard. It probably starts with some kind of a paraphrasing, right? This is what I've heard, and here's how I'd like to address that. Again, this is active listening that shows that you've heard what the other has said, and it also facilitates finding the overlap, the commonality between all parties' interests. It takes some practice, but it's an excellent tool to move the negotiation toward a resolution, toward consensus. And finally, because everything in a negotiation, particularly one that's not recorded, evaporates, right? All the words just sort of evaporate in midair. The question becomes, oh wait, did we finish that conversation? Did we agree on that issue? Wait, did we say that we needed more information? So it's a really good idea to periodically summarize. I don't have an answer for what every 15 minutes, every half an hour, but if there are key decisions that have been made, because remember, most negotiations are multi-issue negotiations, but whether you have resolved or not resolved various issues or concerns, periodically saying something like, okay, let's see where we are. We've talked about issue 1, we've talked about issue 2. I think we've come to a resolution on that. We're putting issue number 3 on hold pending more information from Stan, but for now, sounds like we could take a quick break and come back and start talking about issue number 4. Do you all agree? Right, so the summarizing is key, because otherwise we might find ourselves beating a dead horse. We forget that we've said or agreed. The summarizing is really helpful in that respect. Well, I hope you found these slides useful.